At this time in the afternoon, I knew I needed to do something to get you off your phones. I brought out some Jell-O that I purchased this morning at a Ralph's, not to ridicule the idea of identity, but to remind us something very important about identity itself, the whole concept, the whole identity thing. It looks solid, right? As we get closer and closer, I can kind of shake it a little bit with my ample weight. And when I get closer still, it can just crumble in my fingers. Identity may appear to be solid. It may appear to be fixed. But identity is something which can be shaped and reshaped, sometimes by trauma, sometimes actively, sometimes by history itself. It is fluid. And that fluidity of identity, its ability to be shaped and reshaped, is something which has always interested me as a historian of the modern Middle East, where we've seen new identities arise, old identities collapse in the face of new political movements. But the one that concerns me the most is the Armenian identity, the identity of the Armenians after the genocide of 1915. Put away your phone. Just as a footnote, when I appear at Armenian gatherings, my identity shifts a little bit too from that of the college professor to, in fact, the husband of the noted art historian Helnar Zeitlian Watenpaugh, who's written extensively about the Roslin Gospels, which Kuno, one of our previous guests, has purchased for the Getty Museum. And also the son-in-law of Sona Zeitlian, a historian of Armenian women's movements, and a popular writer on Armenian women's history. But today I've come here as a historian of the modern Middle East, as a historian of genocide, to look at the impact of the genocide on Armenian identity. Now, identity itself is a topic, an idea that we as historians feel sometimes very uncomfortable dealing with. It's an uncomfortable idea because it seems to elide and collapse all sorts of wonderful human differences. Things like class, things like education. Why is it that we can talk about an Armenian identity that involves Zabelia Sayan, who's the subject of the next speaker's talk, and a peasant farmer somewhere near Musada? Are they both Armenian? Does that even matter in that case, to call them that? But genocide is something different. Genocide is something different because genocide is built around the basic idea of not just mass killing, but about stripping away identity. Something I tell my hundreds and hundreds, and I'm going to advertise UC Davis here for a moment. UC Davis is responsible for educating more American young people about the Armenian genocide than any other university in the University of California system. And we do so without any Armenian philanthropic support either. Is that genocide is not just about killing, although there's a great deal of that takes place. Genocide is also about stripping away identity, the human being of the victim of genocide, what makes them human, not just their ID papers, but separating them from communities, taking away names, moving them into places of the world in which they are unfamiliar, in which they don't have the social support systems which allow them to be connected. I call these the tendons that connect the individual to his or her community, that makes them have meaning in that community. And there's a particular word in Armenian that I've come to learn to describe the victim of genocide. And this is a word that I'm hoping will be adopted by other scholars of genocide, not just of the Armenian genocide, to describe this condition. And the word is khilyak. I apologize for my Armenian pronunciation. Khilyak ner, as in shipwreck. And this was a word that was adopted even earlier, in 1915, as early as 1915, to describe the victims of the genocide. And just think about a shipwreck for a moment. What's a shipwreck like? It's this hulk of a strong ship that's been broken up on the rocks, and now it's just a shadow of its former self. But in the case of the Khaliakner, they can no longer care for themselves, but must be cared for by others if they are to survive. And so that forms the basis of my own work on the study of humanitarianism. And those who are interested, I've just published a new book called Bread from Stones, The Middle East and the Making of Modern Humanitarianism, which looks at institutions and groups and organizations like the American Near East Relief and the critical role it played in the restoration of the Armenian community. But as a historian, I'm also interested in the rebuilding of communities through three specific acts. And that's what we're going to talk about today. I want, as a classroom teacher, I want to look up at the screen, but they have this little screen down here I can look at, too. I want to look at three ideas that are important to us as historians in a post-genocide period for understanding what it means to be a survivor. And those three concepts are resistance, resilience, and recovery. Resistance, resilience, and recovery. And I propose to do so in my remaining whatever minutes I have, to look at those ideas through three iconic images, which may be familiar to some of you, but I will certainly take a moment to describe them. The first of these images is a kind of a nefarious class photograph. I know many of you remember your kindergarten photos and so on. You look back on them lovingly. This is a photograph taken during World War I on the front steps of the the Turkish government orphanage in Antura, a city north of Beirut, which was the site of an insidious experiment started by Jamal Pasha, one-third of the Young Turk Triumvirate, and his confidant, Halide Edip Adevar. The idea of this orphanage, and we know a great deal about this because we have the memoir of Karnik Panian, who is a beloved teacher at the Gemaran that I'm sure has touched the lives of at least some of you in this room or your relatives, who was interned, or imprisoned, if you will, in this orphanage during the war. The point of this orphanage was to change young Armenian and young Kurdish people, orphans, gathered up during the war, into Turks, by systematically stripping away from them their pre-genocide identity. This meant circumcising the boys. This meant giving new names. This included forced Islamization and indoctrination into the new political order. But we know that it didn't work very well. When the orphanage was liberated by French and British forces at the end of the Second World War, the president of the American University in Beirut, Bayard Dodge, traveled up the coast from Beirut to the orphanage, went in, saw that the Turkish caretakers had all left. It was probably a lot like a Lord of the Flies moment with a bunch of young Armenian boys sort of running around, trying to make order out of chaos. And they go in and they see that the moment the Turkish caretakers left, in the words of Bayard Dodge, the children asserted their rights. They stopped using their Turkish names. They spoke Armenian. And from hiding places around the orphanage, under blankets or under rocks, they pulled out little tokens of Armenian memory. Books, prayer books, songs that they had sung. Now, how is it that a modern nation state, or a centralizing empire as powerful as the Ottoman Empire, in a place that Jamal Pasha, one of the most powerful men in the world in that time, with a brilliant helper in the form of Halide Edip, how come they couldn't get little Karnik Panian to stop speaking Armenian and use a Turkish name? That's this idea of resilience and resistance. There was something going on that we as historians need to understand. Wow, I am such a historian, I just want to talk forever. We see these two ideas in this other image. The image of Lutfia Belemjian, who as a 9-year-old child was taken from her family, who were then executed on the road from Aintab, who then was forced to live as a slave in a Bedouin household for much of a decade, who upon learning that Near East Relief and the League of Nations had created a way for young Armenian women to rejoin the Armenian community, fled that household and made her way to Aleppo. And we have here her first person of account telling us how she kept her Armenianness even though she was imprisoned for so long in the Bedouin households. And then finally, this image here. And this is one of these, it's a bureaucratic document. It's a Nansen passport, which for many Armenians in the interwar period spelled the difference between life and death, between success and failure. It allowed Armenians, victims of the genocide, to travel in search of citizenship and in search of work. It was an international document, much like a kind of a laissez-passer for refugees that the United Nations creates today. And this is the passport of one Onig Ispengian from Smyrna, whose family survived the genocide, but then we know from this passport he wandered from capital to capital in Western Europe, much like a contemporary Syrian refugee trying to figure out a way to make his way to safety and to work. And this passport was the difference between him failing and him succeeding. But there's something very important to understand in this passport about identity as well, which is that it was valid for everywhere in the world except one place. And that one place was Turkey. It says very explicitly on the top that this passport is valid for use except entering Turkey. So while he survived, he resisted and he resisted and he was resilient. His recovery, if you will, was based on the abandonment of homeland in its entirety. And in the case of Onik, there is a kind of a happy ending. He used this passport to get on a boat in Southampton in England, travel across the Atlantic Ocean to the United States, where he enrolled at Columbia University, earned a medical degree, married a local woman, established a family. And we know this because his granddaughter is the one who saved this passport and contributed it to a library. And one wonders why such a document must have been so important. It was a new identity, a bureaucratic identity, one that existed in the spaces created by governments. But it was also a document that said, you can no longer go home. You can only go forward. So I challenge you to think about, when you discuss identity and what it means, to think about these three items. To resist the attempt to destroy identity. To be resilient in the face of the challenges to identity. And finally, how those two acts can contribute to the recovery of identity and the rebuilding of community. And you can never achieve the identity that existed before something as traumatic as genocide, but certainly you can recover something that will allow you to persist and take the ultimate act, or make the ultimate act, I think, in resistance, which is survival. Thank you.